One of the things I've always valued is honesty. And I think that's the reason that anytime that people would badmouth healthcare or physicians, I felt like I always needed to interject the healthcare side of things, the perspective, because I felt like they didn't have all the information. And so if they were going to form this opinion, form this judgment, honestly, that they had to have the full information. I felt like they were missing information, whether somebody was upset because I can't believe this physician did this. And it was like, well, that's actually the standard of care. Every physician, not every, most physicians would have done that because that's the standard practice. And so I wanted to arm them with that information so they could make an honest judgment, an honest opinion, make sure they were upset at the right things. And this is something I've had to learn through the years because it's always been a great frustration for me when people don't understand the full picture. Not that I expect people to understand the full picture. I understand that people aren't in healthcare. They don't always know how it works. They don't always know that physicians don't have all the power, that some decisions are made by administration, that physicians have to work within the confines of rules that might be made by legislators, that might have to work within rules made by their institution or so forth. And so I know that people don't know that, just like I don't understand a lot of aspects of the legal world because I don't work within it, or I don't a lot of different businesses I don't understand because I don't work within it. And so many times I have found myself through the years wanting to interject to explain the other side of people's opinions when they have villainized medicine. And I think it particular would always hit a nerve for me because I know that most of the time, not all the time, let's be honest, but most of the time, those people that they're villainizing have good intent, that they want to help, that their intention is good. Now, there are always some providers, like some of these thoughts and opinions that a physician's motivation is money doesn't come from nowhere. There are some that is true, but most of the time it's not. And I would want to interject and explain because I often felt that as physicians, we're often put between a rock and a hard place. Whether it was we were being villainized by patients because they didn't like what we had access to or the decisions we made, and what we had access to was determined by legislation or our administration, and that administration is our boss, are our employers. And so we're often in this tug of war between the two, and we can't win. Or whether we are villainized from the patients and we can understand their perspective. In all these situations, we can understand their frustration, and we're also human. So we are going to make mistakes. We're not going to be perfect. And we're stuck between this rock and this hard place. And I think that value of wanting people to understand so they can have all the facts and make an honest decision, an honest judgment, an honest opinion has been something I've struggled with for a lot of times because that's my values and other people's value, and sometimes people don't want it. And so I've learned through the years, walking that tightrope, finding that balance, getting consent of, do you want to hear the other side of things? Do you want to know, or do you just want a chance to share your feelings? Finding that balance and walking that tightrope and knowing that inside I may feel really frustrated listening to healthcare be villainized and thinking at the same time, we're on the same side, or the healthcare providers and you, maybe not that healthcare provider, but in general, because oftentimes what happens, it gets generalized to all physicians and all hospitals and all healthcare providers. Say you're from the same side and that they're often trying. That often the providers are trying and they're not going to be perfect. They're not perfect. They're human and they want to do better. I think this is one of my strengths of why many people hire me to do their gender education and consulting, because I do bring this balance. I do see the best in people. I do assume good intent. And many times, providers and institutions have had the experience where they do want to understand and learn better, but without being villainized for not knowing things, without wanting to feel bad or feeling judged that they don't know or they haven't figured out how to improve their practice to be more inclusive, to demonstrate more gender competency. Anyway, I digress. So I've learned to hear and manage my own feelings, but it's not always easy. And it came up again recently when the executive order came out on gender affirming care ban for those 19 and younger. Now, I'm going to be honest, when it first came out, I was very angry and frustrated to create a ban that goes against the standard of care, that goes against best medical practices agreed upon by multiple professional medical institutions and organizations. I was angry. And then to hear that some institutions were considering stopping their care immediately, I was really upset. And because I was scared, there are many people that I know and I've helped and that I was concerned for and what it meant for them. But then as I began to read the comments and the criticism and the assumptions of the motivation of why the decisions were being made to stop care, to pause care, or what was going on, because we didn't know a lot of what was going on. Were they pausing care? Were they stopping? Was it how long was it gonna be? Were they just reorganizing? Like, what was going on? So many people just put out assumptions, and that instinct that I have to defend of, "Hold on, I value honesty, and assumptions are not honest, and you're not being honest that these are assumptions. You're throwing things out there without explaining that's just you guessing. You're not telling us what's fact and what's not. You're going against my values here." But as well as villainizing the people and the institutions that had been supporting those very families. And so it forced me to take a step back and say, okay, what is going on here? And think about who's making the decisions. Well, typically it's a board. And I started looking up who makes up a lot of these hospital boards that make the decision of whether or not there is gender affirming care clinic or not. Well, the boards are mainly made up of non-physicians. I think I read something like only 15% of hospital boards in this country have physicians, healthcare providers on them. And then I started pausing to be like, what is actually going on here? Like, are clinics closing down? Some were not. What is at risk? What is the decision making here? And I know there was concern about federal dollars. I know we were waiting to see if the lawyers would bring up cases, which they eventually did. But at the beginning, we're waiting to find out. And I don't know what the hospitals knew or didn't know about what cases were going to be filed and weren't filed. And it was kind of a game of chicken, right? Would federal dollars be pulled before these legal cases could be brought? Because if federal dollars were pulled, we're talking about billions of dollars to institutions that had a lot of federal funding for educational and research purposes. And would an institution be able to keep functioning if those dollars were pulled? And even if they were challenged in court, how long would it take to get those dollars back? And what would happen to an institution? What could an institution do and not do in that time? So all these questions were going about as I watched, understandably, as families were angry and upset, but their anger was targeted at the institutions that had supported them. And because from their perspective, those institutions were turning their back on them. But I also knew that they didn't understand the decisions being made there. Many institutions were pausing to try to get as much information together, to try to hold on and take care of as many patients as they could without losing everything and everyone. And many institutions paused. What did that mean? Paused meant they they kept taking care of the patients they had. They didn't take on new patients, and the patients they had could not advance. What does that mean, not advance? It meant if somebody was getting puberty blockers and they were ready to advance to cross-sex hormones, estrogen or testosterone, if that's what was appropriate for that patient's care, they were not going to be advanced. They were going to stay at puberty blockers for now until things could be figured out. If somebody was socially transitioned and ready for a puberty blocker, they were paused. So many institutions paused. And so many families panicked because they didn't know how long was this going to be? What was going to happen? Were they going to close their doors forever? What was going to happen to their child? What was going to happen to their children? Their children also hearing the news, and how is it going to affect their mental health? And would they view this as the people, the professionals turning their backs on them? And I know from one gender affirming care provider, I had heard them say they were so worried about their patients. They couldn't say anything because they also had a huge target on their back. They were a big institution in this country. They had a lot of federal dollars for research. So they came off of a pause. Ironically, the same day that a huge article came out in their local paper saying, this institution turned their back on their patients. The day that came out and the institution had paused, did not shut down, but had paused. This article came up, turned their back on their patients. The day that article came out is the day the pause ended. So they started taking new patients. They started advancing care as appropriate. But that institution could not counter that message because they don't want a target on their back to take away federal funds. And we could argue whether that's right or wrong. Every institution has their values, and their values may include equity and inclusion, education, research. And they're taking the whole picture and the whole institution, and they have priorities, and they're going to make decisions based on priorities. It's something I talk when I speak to institutions, when I speak to departments, I talk to them about the decisions that they need to make are based on their values and the priorities of those values. And that's why every institution makes a different decision. But now I want to talk to you as a provider, whether you are the provider that directly does gender affirming care or whether you're in an institution that does, even if you don't directly do that gender affirming care, you may feel affected the way we often do when healthcare is villainized. That even though you may not directly be involved, it sometimes hurts. It sometimes feels familiar. And it's frustrating because you want to say, hey, wait, we're on your side. How could you turn on us? How could you be so angry at us? I find often that providers tend to have three main responses. There's way more than three, and sometimes it's a combo of responses. It may depend on the time of day or the day itself. But in general, I would say there are three main ones. Some providers have the response of completely agreeing, validating, and understanding. Absolutely. You're upset. You have every right to be upset. They turn their backs on you. Even a pause, unacceptable. A second response is anger and resentment and frustration, but with continued support. What do I mean? It's like, I can't believe it. They just turn their backs on it. We have been there. We've sacrificed. We put a lot of things on the line. We've lost funding in the past, but you still support that gender affirming care clinic. You're just angry about patient response. And it creates that bigger divide, us and them, patients and their families, and us as providers. You don't stop supporting it, but you're filled with a bitter resentment. And the third big response is turning your back. I'm just not going to support it anymore. I'm done. Walk away. Like, how dare you? How dare you? We've been supportive. We've provided the care, and you put us all over the papers, made us villains, don't understand. No, we're done. I'm done. And I just want to say, if you're listening to this and your response is 2 or 3, I'm guessing it's not the way you want to be. It's not who you want to be. It may be how you feel, maybe your human response. I give you that, but I don't think it's who you want to be. So, how do you be the person you want to be? And yet, without pushing down these feelings, because your feelings aren't wrong. Your feelings are there for a reason. Your feelings are because you're hurt. Your feelings are because you're upset. And so, how do you let those feelings be there, but allow yourself to show up as the provider you want to be? Allow yourself to continue to be the support, because if you're here and listening, you value inclusion. You value providing evidence-based care, which gender affirming care is that. You value keeping politics out of medicine. And you know that gender affirming care is exactly that. It's standard healthcare. So, how do you allow yourself to stick to those values and not let those emotions, which are human and completely understandable, to be hurt and upset? There are 4 big tips I can give you. The first one's to take care of yourself. Don't lose yourself. Do something, maybe every day, every couple of days, at least once a week, that is for you, something you enjoy. Maybe it's reading, maybe it's taking a walk, maybe it's time with your family, maybe it, and I know in medicine, it's like, where am I going to do that? But I also think sometimes doing this stuff for yourself feels like, I need an hour. I need 2 hours to do this. How I challenge those thoughts. I'll give you a story. I didn't read for many years. I love to read for pleasure. For me, like reading, I need at least an hour. And at some point, somebody challenged me, can you read for 10 minutes? Like, do you have 10 minutes? And I thought, I have 10 minutes. And I honestly felt like I could never do 15, but I could do 10. 10 felt like doable. 15 did not. 10 is doable. So I set my timer. I knew first thing in the morning I could read for 10 minutes. Set my timer. I read for 10 minutes. When that timer went off, I put my bookmark, closed my book, walked away. I started doing that every day. And it brought me so much joy, brought something back in my life. And that's what I mean. Sometimes we have this idea because maybe it's the way we used to do it. But can you find that thing that is just something for you, not for anybody else, but for you, in a time that we challenge that it has to be hours and hours worth? So take care of yourself. Maybe it's meditating. There are guided meditations that are 3 minutes and 5 minutes. Maybe it's journaling. Maybe it's having a conversation with a friend on the phone, or however you have a conversation with a friend. I guess I'm old school and showing my age. All right, to do something that takes care of yourself, that's just for you. The second one is support for yourself. Whether, like I said, those feelings are valid and we don't want to shove them down. So finding a way to have them. Maybe that is journaling. Maybe that is having a coach. Maybe that is having a therapist. Maybe that is learning how to manage stress. A great podcast I recommend is Mindful Healers. Mindful Healers is a podcast specifically for physicians, done by a physician, talking about how to handle the stress of practice. Highly recommended. So Mindful Healers is that podcast. Maybe it's having somebody that you trust, a friend that you can talk to and vent, that is willing to take that on, that you feel good after talking to, that allows you to have your feelings. You don't feel judged, but it also helps you move forward with them. So find that way to support yourself and the feelings that you're having. The third thing is, especially when you're with patients or when you're thinking about patients, learn to switch the focus. What I mean by that and switching the focus is, many times focus is on us. Why are they so upset with us? Why are they so upset with me? What have we done? I've been trying hard. Notice how it's very defensive, right? But if I switch the focus to the patient, I wonder what's happened to them. I wonder what they've been through. I wonder how I can be of support. I wonder what I can do. Notice how that I become curious. I begin to open up and create a calm rather than that closed off defensiveness. So switching that focus away from myself and to the patient creates that more open, curious feeling rather than closed and defensive. And my fourth recommendation is know your boundaries. Where are those limits of that you need to create? Now, I want to be clear. Sometimes when people talk about setting boundaries, they think it's to control somebody else, what somebody else does, meaning my boundary is you can't yell at me. Well, I hate to tell you this, but there's no way to control what somebody else does because if I knew how to control what somebody else does, I always say you'd be living in Shannon's world. And so you're not. So that's not possible. But what we can do is control ourselves. So, for example, if a boundary for you is not allowing, you don't want to be yelled at or you don't want to be cursed at, whatever, setting that boundaries. So, say it's not being yelled at. If a patient's upset and they start yelling at you, setting a boundary is not changing their behavior. You say something like, I understand you're upset and I don't want to be yelled at. If you need to yell, I'm going to step out of the room. You can yell all you want. I'm happy to talk to you. I'll come back when you're ready to talk. I don't want to be yelled at. So I'm going to step out. That's setting a boundary. You're not asking them to stop yelling. You're just letting them know that you can have a conversation when they're not yelling. That's a boundary. Not asking them to their behavior, change their behavior, just saying what you will do in those instances. So those are the four things. Because right now, your transgender, non-binary patients and their families need you as the ally and the support. Yes, you may at times feel frustrated because you are between a rock and a hard place. And guess what? Your patients don't have the benefit of being able to walk away and be like, I'm not dealing with this. They don't have that benefit. You want to talk about between a rock and a hard place? This is the time. It's not always about being easy, but you know that. So, your value is to be inclusive. Then make it a value to take care of yourself. Your value is to support all your patients, including the transgender non-binary patients. Then it's time. It's time to step up. It's time to understand feelings. It's a time to take care of your own feelings because values matter.